Welcome to my 2024 book review. Last year I read 19 books, 17 I read, and then 2 were audiobooks. I read 2 series and I'm still in the middle of reading them. I didn't read them back to back, so I think the easiest way to go through those is to just talk about one series at a time and then go to the next series and then talk about the individual books. So I'm not like hopping back and forth between Throne of Glass and then Princess Diaries. I feel like that would get a little chaotic. Also, these are not all of the books that I read in 2024. I got 8 of them from the library. I'm gonna start with where I picked up from last year when I was reading Throne of Glass. So The Assassin's Blade is about Celaena Sardothian, and she is one of her kingdom's most notorious assassins, and it tells the story of Celaena going on all these adventures that her master has her go to, and you see how all these short stories intertwine to lead up to Throne of Glass. I had decided to read Throne of Glass first, then Crown of Midnight, then Assassin's Blade. I am loaning it to somebody, so I don't have it with me. Honestly, if someone was wanting to read the series, I would recommend reading Assassin's Blade first, because the relationships with other people progress in that order, starting with Assassin's Blade. If you're starting with Throne of Glass, it starts off really confusing, and then also it kind of spoils some things that have already happened from the Assassin's Blade. Even though I know that the Throne of Glass book did come out first, I just think storyline wise, it's better to read the Assassin's Blade first because you know what's happening. It was also kind of harder to get into the Assassin's Blade. It's broken up into 5 short stories. As they went on, I liked them more and more, and they became more engaging, and you could see where it was going and how it led up into where Throne of Glass starts. But there are a lot of really important characters that are in the Assassin's Blade. As long as you read it before Empire of Storms, I think it's probably fine, because a lot of the characters from the Assassin's Blade and those short stories from the past do come back. I would rate this book probably an 8 out of 10 just because it was kind of hard to get into, but I did love how you saw how Celaena's story began and how she became who she had to be in Throne of Glass that would propel her throughout the rest of the series. And I really liked how Sarah J. Maas laid another foundation beneath Throne of Glass to show you how Celaena became who she was. Next is Heir, and this one kind of threw me for a loop because it was confusing going from Throne of Glass to Crown of Midnight and then having to go back to Assassin's Blade. I don't want to give too much away about the rest of the series, but there's 2 new characters that are introduced. Manon, who is a witch, and then Rowan, who is one of the most brutal fae warriors that exists in their realm. And Celaena goes to train with Rowan, and their heartbreaking past experiences help bring out the best in each other. I'm not gonna lie, and I'm probably gonna get hate for this, but Rowan isn't really one of my favorite characters. He's just kind of a brooding man. I wish he kind of had more of an attitude to match Celaena's. I would give this one 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed it, and it was really engaging to read, and I enjoyed all of the adventure. Next in the series is Queen of Shadows, and I loved this one. We're back in Rifthold, where a lot of the action of all of the books happens in. There were some characters from the past that came back in this one. I just love that the action was back to back, and I love that the main character has all these schemes, and the way that she accomplishes her schemes are so brilliant. And I really enjoyed how this tied in all of the characters from the past book and how all of their paths crossed in this one. So 10 out of 10 for Queen of Shadows. I loved this one. Empire of Storms was insane. This was the last book that I finished this year, so I did try to do the tandem read, and I highly regret that. I think it took me so long because Empire of Storms has so much action back to back. So the tandem read is reading Empire of Storms and Tower of Dawn together. You can find a list online, and it basically goes back and forth between a bunch of the chapters because they're occurring at the same time. But honestly, I did this for about half of both of them, and then I just decided to finish this one because I would get super intrigued by the action that was happening in this book, and then I would go to Tower of Dawn, which is definitely a slower burn of a book. So there's a lot of world building happening. I just think it would be better to read this one first and then Tower of Dawn. Read them separately because they're 2 completely separate storylines. And basically, some of the characters from Queen of Shadow split off, and some of them are in Empire of Storms and some of them are in Tower of Dawn. So I don't know, I wouldn't recommend reading them together because they're just very different stories. But I would definitely give this one a 10 out of 10. I love all the romances that happened in this book. I love the character development, and then the end was just absolutely heart-shattering. But at least it's good that I'm already about halfway through Tower of Dawn now, because now I only have to read half of that to find out what happens to all the characters in Kingdom of Ash, so I guess that worked out for me. The next series I'm going to talk about is kind of a funny story. Growing up, I know we all watched The Princess Diaries. I know I still watch it sometimes because it's very nostalgic, and it's honestly just a great movie. Who doesn't love Anne Hathaway and Julie Andrews? The other series I read in 2024 was The Princess Diaries. One of my friends has the first 3 books, and so I had borrowed it from her, and I got so enthralled with Princess Mia and her funny, silly stories that I ended up getting a box set from a thrifted books website, where I found out that there's like 2 to 3 names for each of the books. In the movie, it's set in San Francisco, and in the book, it's actually in New York City. So I kind of had to reset my mind and think about where everything was happening. But you get to see Mia being a normal 14-year-old teenager, and her being catapulted and being told that she's actually the heir of a throne of a European country. I just absolutely adore this series. It's really funny kind of getting into the head of a 14-year-old and seeing how her becoming a princess is just as dramatic in her head as having her first crush. There's so many moments in these books where I would just laugh out loud because Mia's very witty. Also, Michael is the best book boyfriend ever. I've read 5 of the books and 1 of the novellas so far, and I'm excited to read the rest of the series this year. I gave the first Princess Diaries a 5 out of 5 on Goodreads just because I enjoyed it so much, and it kind of catapulted me back into that early high school mindset, and I thought it was so funny and endearing. But just because of the fact that I enjoyed it, I would give it a 10 out of 10. I thought it was so adorable. If you love the Princess Diaries movies like me and you want to experience more of her and her friends' stories and more about when she was growing up, then I would definitely give the Princess Diaries a read. The second Princess Diaries book, this one's called Take Two, but the version that I read was called Princess in the Spotlight. It's the exact same book, they just have multiple names. The premise of the second book is that her grandma, Queen Clarice, is making Mia do an international interview on live television, and it's a lot of her prepping for that and her anxieties of that. And then also Princess Mia has a secret admirer, which is really sweet, and you kind of get back in the mindset of what it's like to be 14 and have a crush on somebody. Out of 10, I'd probably say like a 7.58 out of 10. It was super adorable. There wasn't as many quick jokes as I feel like there was in the first one, but I still really enjoyed it. The third book in the Princess Diaries series is Third Time Lucky, and the other version of the book is Princess in Love, and this one I feel like was about just as good as the first Princess Diaries book. You get to see Mia in love, and it's so sweet, and the ending, when a secret somebody reveals his feelings to Mia in the most adorable way, and you get to see more of her grandma's antics and more character development between all of her friends. I would say it's probably like an 8 or 8.5 just because the ending was so sweet, but yeah, I love this one as well. The next Princess Diary book I read was called Mia Goes Forth, and it's also called Princess in Waiting. So this is the one where she's in Genovia for like a good first chunk of the book. I don't know why, but when she was in Genovia, it was like very kind of slow to read. I just kind of felt like there was a lull in this one, but I still enjoyed Mia's sense of humor and her little adventures. It seemed like there was less of a big plot in this one than the previous 3, but I still thought it was super adorable. I'd probably give it a 6 out of 10. The next Princess Diary book I read was a novella, which was called The Princess Project. This one was really easy to read. It was only 50 pages. I think I read it in like one sitting. It's all of Mia and her friends, and they go to help build houses on their spring break. Not much happened in this book. It was just kind of a little interlude between the last one and this one. I'd probably give it like a 7.5 out of 10 stars. And then the last Princess Diaries book that I read in 2024 is called Give Me 5, or it's also called Princess in Pink. I adored this one. It was all about Mia and her getting ready for the prom, and I feel like there was just a really funny plot at the beginning of this book. It just felt like there was a lot of quick humor, and a lot of the events happened back to back, and there was no real lulls in this book. The way that the book begins, the plot line is just pretty absurd, where an instance with her grandma leads to a hotel strike all around the entirety of New York City, and Lily is like the leader who's catalyzing a lot of the strike, and it's just really funny. I'd probably say like a 9 out of 10. I really enjoyed this one, and I'm excited to read the next one. I can't wait to get back into the Princess Diaries. So now I'll get into all of the independent books that I read over the year. The very first book that I had read in 2024 was The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. Obviously the movie came out last year, so there was a lot of hype around this book. It's about Coriolanus Snow, who is President Snow before he's president, when he was 18 years old, and he lives in the Capitol, and the plot occurs around the 10th annual Hunger Games. He is a mentor for the 10th Hunger Games, and he's mentoring Lucy Gray. You see even from the beginning how he becomes more and more of a psychopath. Coriolanus gets darker and darker as the book goes on. You can see how even love can't save him from the darkness that's inside. There's a lot of kind of crazy plot points that happen, but they're very far apart. I feel like there could have been like 150 pages chopped from this book and it would have been fine. I feel like the last 70 pages really saved this book from me just not liking it at all, because there was so much action. I'd probably give this book a 7 out of 10. I really enjoyed the plot points. I love the Hunger Games. I grew up reading it, but I would dock it just because there's kind of a lot of fluff. I really hope that we get Tigress's story, because I want to know what's going on between her in this book and then how she becomes who she was in, I think it was in Mockingjay, right? Towards the middle of the year in the summer, I kind of had to take a break from reading fun books, and I had to read books for school. They weren't that bad. The first one that I read, and apparently I was one of two. This was my like, you know on Goodreads how they show you the most shelved and least shelved books of the year? Well, this one was the least shelved that I had read, and me and one other person had shelved this book this year, and one of the other people was somebody that was in my class. So Best Care Anywhere by Phillip Longman tells the history of the Veterans Affairs and how it went from kind of having a bad name and being very dysfunctional to being the standard for quality care in the American healthcare system, which is actually very interesting. It also talks about how a lot of the systems that the VA uses and how the Veterans Affairs, the doctors will prescribe things or do certain procedures, and they're not going to get paid more by cutting you open, which I think is really good, because obviously we don't want to be giving people medications and having them do surgeries and procedures where it's really just not necessary. I think I underlined some things. Because the VA lacks any financial incentive to engage in overtreatment, it saves money by avoiding unnecessary surgery and redundant testing. And the VA also has incentives for investing in prevention and effective treatment that are lacking in the private sector. There's a story from this book that was really cool that I'll read. Ironically, in the course of testing the effects of LSD in the early 1960s, a VA hospital in Palo Alto, California gave it to a man named Vic Lovell, who enjoyed the trip so much that he turned on his friend and neighbor Ken Kesey to the psychedelic experience. Kesey got himself a job at the VA to secure his supply, eventually stealing LSD from the hospital when the trials were over. While tripping with schizophrenics in the hospital's psychiatric ward, Kesey received the inspiration he would later say for his masterpiece, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He and his band of merry pranksters went on to make acid seem cool to a whole generation of Americans. But I thought this was funny because I was in my bed reading the book, and then I look over and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was on my bookshelf next to me, which I still haven't read that book. I've had that book on my shelf since high school. I just thought the history was really interesting. Obviously, it's probably a little bit biased. Yeah, the first version came out in 2007. This came out in 2012, so that's 13 years ago. It's kind of outdated. I don't necessarily know everything that still stands today. Just for learning purposes, I'd probably give it a 9 out of 10. The next book I read was Peace at Last by Deborah L. Grassman. She was a nurse who worked at the hospice unit at a Veterans Affairs. She talks about how she helped veterans who were experiencing severe trauma and pain from serving in the military, and how she helped them achieve peace before passing away. A lot of these stories honestly had me crying, and it made me very appreciative. It was also really interesting to learn about a lot of the wars and how it's differently affected those groups of people that have served in each one. It also has a lot of good advice, especially if you're gonna work in a hospital, especially in a hospice setting. Like she says here, asking people to consider forgiveness without pressuring them is important. I've also come to realize that forgiveness may be the simplest and hardest thing for each of us are asked to do. To not forgive may be the most foolish, because we might arrive at the end of our lives filled with bitterness. Bitterness is a venom for the soul. I would rate it a 10 out of 10 because I just really enjoy hearing other people's stories, and it They were so good. The next book I read, Funny Story by Emily Henry. I read this book together with one of my best friends. She had visited me from Missouri, and her mom is actually a librarian, so she was able to reserve 2 copies of this book and bring it down here so we could read it together. And it was such a fun experience. We both love reading romance books, so this was really fun to read together and talk about it. Funny Story follows Daphne and Miles. They just became roommates because both of their exes left them for each other. So it tells the story between Daphne and Miles and how they're going through this heartbreak. This story feels like such a cozy summer read. It's happening in a lakeside town in Michigan, and Daphne, the main character, is a librarian. Daphne is very type A, and Miles is very opposite of that. He works as a sommelier, and I love this trope when they pretend to be together to kind of get back at their exes. One thing that my friend had said about this book, which I agree with, was I wish it was from both of their points of view, because I feel like it's always interesting saying, like, when 2 people are falling for each other, seeing both of their points of view so you're not just guessing on the other end. I would give it a 9.5 out of 10. I really enjoyed this book. It was one of my favorites that I read last year, and I definitely want to read more romance books this year. The next book that I read is called Sylvia's Second Act by Hilary Yablon. I think that's how you say her last name. This book was so funny. I actually got one of my friends to read it, and then she got her mom to read it. It's really a book that if you're any age you can read it and kind of relate to what's going on. The book follows Sylvia, who is a 63-year-old woman living in Boca, Florida, and Sylvia walks in her bedroom and finds her husband cheating with one of the other women who lives at their retirement community, and she's kind of been living in a loveless marriage for many years, so she takes that as her sign to pack up and move to New York City with her best friend Evie. So it follows them finally following their dreams, so you get to see both of them start over and follow the careers that they had always wanted to pursue. I'd probably give it a 9 out of 10. It was a quick read. I thought it was so cute. The ending kind of took me by surprise. Evie and Sylvia were happy, which made me happy, and that's all I want because I love those 2 characters. The next book I actually listened to on audiobook was Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing by Matthew Perry. I really like listening to people's memoirs and autobiographies. I feel like it's interesting hearing it from their point of view versus reading it. This memoir was really heartbreaking. It tells the story of Matthew Perry growing up and how that had led him to Hollywood and wanting to pursue a career in acting. It was really interesting hearing kind of some of the behind the scenes of what was happening in Friends and how he struggled with his drug and alcohol addiction. I really love that he talked about Friends because it's definitely one of my favorite TV shows. It was even interesting hearing the history behind how he came up with some of his lines, like how he says, "Could I be more like whatever," and how that was something that he used to say with his friends when he was growing up, and how that little quip became something that so many people say even now in 2025. I really enjoyed the transparency of this book. It was honestly a very dark book. The timeline kind of jumped very sporadically to like the past and then back to the future, which even though I was listening to it on audiobook, I kind of found it hard to follow at times. So just for that reason, I would give it a 9 out of 10. Next we have The Secret History by Donna Tartt, and oh my god, this book was such a headache. I liked it, but it gave me a headache. I'm generally a fast reader. I think it took me like four months to read this book. This book follows Richard, who moves from California up into the New England area, and how it follows him pursuing a degree in the classics, as in like Greek classics. I don't know if there's other classics. I don't know, I was a STEM major. And it follows him and the group of 6 who are in this Greek classics classes. It's the quintessential dark academia book. The first 2 pages of the book state outright that they kill one of their friends, and then the rest of the book is describing why. The beginning I was kind of confused by because they were talking so much about Greek classics and I just absolutely was not following. The author was able to really clearly explain from those stories to connect the Greek literature with how that propelled the characters throughout the book, if that makes sense, because there's a lot of parallels between them. You do see how the main character Richard is he's not a good source. He very much romanticizes what's going on around him. I just accidentally flipped to this page that I had underlined, but I feel like it perfectly describes this book. It says, I suppose that when anyone accustomed to working with the mind is faced with a straightforward action, there's a tendency to embellish, to make it overly clever, which I feel like describes the entire book. It's like very wordy and descriptive. Also, this book is literally 8 chapters and they're extremely long. It also looks a lot shorter than it actually is. It's 559 pages, which is it's a huge book. It looks deceivingly small, but it's not. I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Just because it took me so long and it was kind of hard, but the ending I think was pretty rewarding. I was proud of myself for reading all this. The next book I read was called Just Last Night by Mhairi McFarlane. This book follows Eve and her friend group. So this group of friends has been friends since they were teenagers and now they're 34. And then all of a sudden the friend group experiences a tragedy, which is the catapult for the rest of the story. And it introduces somebody from Eve's past. After this tragedy occurs, there's more information about the past that Eve didn't know about, and it's very shocking. I feel like this book kind of took me for lots of twists and turns. I really love the character development for the people who end up being the 2 main characters. I'll give it a 9 out of 10 stars. I really enjoyed it, and it was definitely a deeper book than I had expected it to be. I have like other things I want to say about this book, but I don't want to spoil it. The last book that I read this year, which I actually listened to on audiobook because again I like listening to memoirs, I read The Third Gilmore Girl by Kelly Bishop, and I think this ended up being my favorite book that I read in 2024. She discusses her entire life. I feel like the timeline was really easy to follow. It talks about her life growing up and how she went from being a ballerina to being an actress in the theater and then in TV and movies. It was incredibly captivating. Kelly Bishop is such a good storyteller. And then, of course, I loved all the behind the scenes of her talking about a chorus line and Gilmore Girls and Dirty Dancing. I thought that was so cool. I love behind the scenes of any TV show or film. A lot of her passions really spoke true to me, like for film and music and art and for animals. She even inspired me to start taking ballet classes. I've taken 3 classes so far. I was a gymnast and I did tap dancing, and I feel like I kind of had neglected that artistic side of myself for many years as I have been pursuing my career. So I feel very, very much in my element being in a ballet class. I give it a 10 out of 10. If I could give it more than a 10, I would give it an 100 out of 10. I loved it. I found it so inspirational. That's all I have for books this year. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts were. If you have any recommendations for me for 2025. Thank you for watching. Okay, bye.